Good morning, everyone. It is a minute past 9:40 on my clock. Um, I'm going to invite you, if you haven't already, to mute yourself as we get started. Otherwise, I will mute you for you to make this class a little easier for everyone. With Sarah being out of town, I am the support teacher this week, and Charles will be offering us his racial roadmap as well. So thank you all for being here this morning. We will get started in the way that we have been with a few minutes for some Lectio Divina. So I'm going to share my screen with you.
Elizabeth, could I ask you a question while you're sharing?
I'm sorry, hold on one second, Aaron. I need to change these settings in order to share it, which I didn't realize was something I had to do. There we go. Anne, I'm sorry, what were you going to ask me?
I had a question this week from someone asking about how do you sign up to share your racial roadmap?
Yes.
Somewhere, or how does that happen?
There's a Sign Up Genius link that I will share at the end of today's class on the chat. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
And I will send you, and I'll email you the link separately too. All right. So I'm going to read our passages for today. Our scripture comes from 1 Corinthians, and then our contemporary wisdom comes from Reverend Lenny Duncan, who is a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Taking apart the cage that Black people find themselves in also starts to dismantle the gilded cage that our white siblings find themselves in. A cage is a cage after all, and God longs for all of us to be free. So I'll give you all a minute to sit with that. All right. I invite you now, using the chat feature, to respond with a word or phrase that stands out to you. Seeing, we see dimly, then I will know fully. Fully known takes some dismantling. Dismantle the cage, face to face, the gilded cage. A cage is a cage. Dismantle, mirror dimly, a cage is a cage. We see in a mirror dimly. I know only in part. God longs for all of us to be free. Cage, cage. Dimly see in a mirror, will I ever see fully? The greatest of these is love. A cage is a cage. Dismantle. Sounds like the word cage really struck a lot of people this morning. I'm going to read them one more time. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Taking apart the cage that Black people find themselves in also starts to dismantle the gilded cage that our white siblings find themselves in. A cage is a cage after all, and God longs for all of us to be free. I'm going to give you another minute. All right. Now I invite you to respond with how you feel that God is speaking to you through these words today. Will I go from dimly to fully seeing? Is that possible as a Caucasian? We can never really feel what it's like, but we can try to understand better. The dual racial cages relate to seeing in a mirror dimly. When we are free, we will understand more fully. God longs for this dismantling to happen. Longing for the truth of that love and freedom, more open to listening fully. God calls us to be a faith in community. Our cages are keeping us from it. Faith, hope, and love. Can we love people and deny their freedom? Will I work to take apart the cages? Good trouble. To dare to see the gilded cage in which I live. Why are we comfortable in our cage? How can I learn to be comfortable without one? What parts of our IPC gilded cage are we willing to look at with compassion for ourselves and will work for change? Dismantling cages must happen for us to each see each other face to face and not through bars. The cage is keeping some people out and others in. Dismantling the cage calls us to trust. The difference, I may be in a cage, but I don't feel like I'm in one. Sounds like God is speaking profoundly to each of you this morning. Right. Thank you all. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Charles as he shares his racial roadmap.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So everyone has had access to this template, and it's handy. And I'll be working from mine. As I do, many of you of a certain age are going to find what I have to share, I think, very similar to what you have to share. And we hope that in future sessions, we'll hear from many more of us about memories and how these things have shaped our lives then and now. The first thing on the template they were asked to recall is a narrative of an early memory that has to do with race. How did it shape our attitudes about race? What do you remember about it? I grew up in a little town over in Arkansas, 50 miles north of the bridge, Osceola, Arkansas. And it was a very typical Southern town. If you've read A Painted House by John Grisham, that's exactly my childhood, except I lived in town in a painted house. My uncles lived on the farm. Actually, they painted their houses too. I had one uncle who had an unpainted house. But it was not an unusual upbringing at all. My dad had grown up in Alabama, and when the call came, World War II, he enlisted in the Army and became an aircraft mechanic. was stationed at Blytheville Air Force Base, met my mom, who was working for the draft board in Osceola. And years later, here I come in 1955. Dad worked as a maintenance mechanic in industry. Osceola is fairly heavily industrialized now for what was formerly a fairly rural small town. And my mom trained one of those career paths that was open to a woman in the 40s was to be a professional secretary, and she trained to be one. And then when my brother and sister and I came along, she took time out, and after I was born, was ready to go back to work before I started school. And so what people did was to hire what we call a nanny. And just about everybody I knew had a nanny. And just about everybody I knew was white. Our nannies were black. I had very fortunately had a wonderful person who was my nanny from memory until school age. Her name was Viola. The things that stick in memory, two things. First, context. My parents had a very high regard for her. She's a Christian woman, very well thought of. They thought a lot of her. And I remember my mom telling me, and I felt like when she told me this, she really didn't need to, but she was erring on the side of caution. You know how kids can be, and kids hear things and repeat things. And she said, don't you ever use that, what we now call the N word. She didn't use that word. At the time, the polite reference to a person of color was they were colored, or she was from that same part of Arkansas, and her family was in North Mississippi and Arkansas, and the polite alternative was Negra, which was sort of the Southern accent, what in the North would have just simply been called a Negro. And those were the acceptable terms, and she made it clear that that other word was not an acceptable term, certainly not as applied to Viola, and I was to never use that term or be rude to her in any way. And I wouldn't have anyway. She was like a second mom. And I remember then a particular time when I was 4 or 5 years old, I had come into possession of a nickel. And a nickel would buy things when in the late 50s, early 60s. And there happened to be a soft serve ice cream store, drive-in ice cream place it was about 2 blocks down the street from where I lived. And I asked Viola to take me to that place to get an ice cream cone because I had a nickel. And she was, of course, very kind. When she got other things done around the house that she was doing, we walked hand in hand down to I think it was called the Breeze Inn, like Tasty Freeze or any number of other similar places that exist in small towns still. And as we approached the place, there's a main entrance, of course, and I was heading there. But before you get to the entrance, there was a large window with a counter, which I'd really never noticed before. And when we got to that point, she stopped, and she had my hand, and so I stopped, and I said, "Aren't we going in?" And she said, "No, honey, I can't go in." And I thought, are your shoes dirty? Or, I'm just looking around trying to figure out why she couldn't go in. And then it just somehow came to me, oh, Black people aren't allowed to go inside. And so we placed our order at the window. And I think actually I may have gone in to receive the ice cream cone and come back out, and we walked on home. But it made an impression. And this would have been about 1959 or 1960. I'll go ahead and share other impressions as the racial roadmap template calls for. And I hope you're looking at yours and thinking about yours as well. And I bet many of you will have very similar memories and events that impressed you that you'll be able to share later on. This was at a time when my doctor's office had two waiting rooms, two water fountains, one for colored, one for white. I never saw Black people. There were no Black people in the neighborhood. Just a couple of maybe 3 or 4 blocks from the house. That's where Black people lived. Of course, all that began to change during this time. I remember my next thing that comes to mind would be about age 8. I knew Viola's nephew, Daniel, who was close to mine, maybe a year older than me. And again, I almost never saw him, just when on the occasion when he'd be with her, when we'd go to pick her up. My mom would drive to Viola's house, pick her up, bring her to our house for the day, and then at night reverse that and take her home. She would sit in the back seat, that's where she felt it was appropriate for her to sit. And so I met Daniel somewhere along the way, and then I was maybe 8 or 9 years old and out playing with a friend on a ditch bank. And in Osceola, it's right on the Mississippi River. And before it was settled, before Europeans settled there, it was a big swamp. And it would be a big swamp today, but for the maintenance of big drainage ditches that actually carry all the water that falls on Osceola, Arkansas, is carried into the St. Francis River, not the Mississippi River. The highest point in eastern Arkansas is the bank of the Mississippi River, and that's due to the 1812 earthquake. So there are these sizable, there's a network of ditches that connect and drain everything out of there into the St. Francis River, which is many miles to the west. And so I was playing on one of those ditch banks with a friend and ran into Daniel and a couple of his friends. And they showed us this really neat, fun thing to do that I'd never seen before. And it was, you take a piece of, like a big cardboard box, and you break it down, and you could slide down the ditch bank on the grass. And that was great fun for an 8 or 9 year old in the early 1960s. I remember playing with Daniel and always enjoyed being around Daniel, but I never saw him. Even by then, we were both in school, but there were separate schools. The Black school system in Osceola was named for a man named Rosenwald, Julius Rosenwald, who was a founding partner, as I recall, in Sears and Roebuck, who financed education for Black people throughout the nation. And that the school district was named the Rosenwald District. And so Daniel went to Rosenwald School, and I only saw him every grade once in a while. That made an impression. Our schools integrated after that, very late in the 1960s, going into the 70s, it was phased in. I had my first Black teacher in the 6th grade for science. Then I played football with Black boys from the 7th grade on. And I remember vividly, and I'll never forget, Lester Armstrong, who I competed with for my position on the football team. And Lester was aptly named. He was a strong kid. We battled all season long. The coach really put us at each other to motivate us. And so some games I would start and some games he would start, but it was a very healthy thing to have that kind of interaction with Black boys, which we never otherwise had. And, of course, in a football team, race really, I don't want to say, obviously it's still there. We all were aware of our races. We were aware of what that meant, but it didn't mean a thing. I can tell you on the practice field, as far as the coach was concerned, it meant nothing. When it came time to compete in a varsity game, it meant nothing. If you could do the job, you were the guy. And that was a healthy thing, and I think a healthy thing for the boys all the boys on the football team. And I think it still continues. We have some equality that creeps into our lives on those things where we compete in sports and otherwise in life. And it brings you very close. You think competition, well, you're going to really dislike each other. Well, no, it's the opposite. You really develop a close bond with boys that way. And then I think the final thing I'll share, again, many years later, I was in college at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, and I was fortunate to land really the peach job for a college kid at that time. Was driving a school bus for the Jonesboro School District. You'd get up really early in the morning and run a route, and come back and shower and go to class. And sometimes you'd have day trips that you'd take during the day, and then you run your afternoon route. And sometimes you'd have trips at night for sporting events and that kind of thing. There was another guy, one of the other bus drivers, who was actually from Osceola, who I'd never known. He was, I think, 3 or 4 years older than I am. I was there to, I was in college getting my undergraduate degree. He was there. He'd come back to get his doctorate in education. And again, this young man had grown up in Osceola, attended the Rosenwald School District, which didn't have the resources my school district had. And now we're talking about, again, rural Arkansas. It's not that our school district was in any way really well equipped, but the black school district, the Rosenwald district, was even less so. And yet here you had this young man who had done well enough in school and in college. He was a teacher and a successful teacher, and he wanted to go into administration and realized an EDD would be the thing that would help him achieve his goals. And so he was driving a school bus too. And the thing, again, impressed me, I didn't know him before that. And it impressed me that he had overcome a pretty significant disadvantage educationally to excel educationally. But the most impressive thing about him was that he was a very kind, gracious person. You would think somebody from that environment might hold some resentment, might not like white people because of what he had experienced. But his pure grace toward me in particular impressed me. And that's something that I've seen and you've seen in leaders in our community. Reverend Ben Hooks comes to mind, who I was fortunate to know. Fred Davis, many others, leaders in the Black community who I've been fortunate to know, exude such grace in spite of the resentment they could feel. And that impresses me. And you don't hear that much about that. So that's what I would share. And as I say, I think many of you have memories in our small groups. Elizabeth, during one of the breakout sessions early on, we took the opportunity to share memories like that. And Jimmy Humphreys was on in the small group Barbara and I were in a few weeks ago. And Jimmy's not on this call today, but Jimmy had a really interesting story to tell, paralleling what I've just told you. Jimmy's a little older, grew up in Cordova. So I look forward to hearing from others in this group and others who may sign up using the link Elizabeth's going to provide, and to hear some of your experiences and some of the things in your lives that have shouted out at you as these things have in mind.
Thank you, Charles.
David,
Here's
I'm here.
Jimmy. Hey.
Okay.
Jimmy is here today. Good to see you, Jimmy. I'm just going to invite you all now, if you have any clarifying questions for Charles, not challenging him per se, but clarifying questions about his story. Charles looks like he's up for a challenge though. So any questions for Charles? Looks
Charles,
like that's a question.
yeah. Hey, Charles, thank you so much for sharing that. I had, I'm just curious, the stories that you shared, particularly from your childhood, they're so intimate. And the way you told them, I just kind of felt like I was right there, which I appreciate. And I'm wondering, you know, when you were working on your racial roadmap, did you return to these stories for the first time in a long time? Or was it more like, you know, these have kind of been rattling around for me and I didn't realize how often my memory played them back in my mind, but I'm now shining an intentional light on them? Or was it kind of a surprise to uncover them? Could you talk about the experience of doing your racial roadmap?
Yeah, it's a good question, Julie. No, these things live with me all the time. Just like my early memories of my parents and friends and environment. But as I say, these are sentinel events. These are things that really stand out. There are lots of other things growing up that that I could recall as well. But no, those are the things that I really think about them a lot. And of course, especially about Viola. As I said, up until school age, I was with her every day, and she was great. Just and she was she's a special person, and you know, like your mother, just makes an impression on you when you know somebody that way. I think that's that particular experience because it was intimate. Um, Child, mother figure at home, period of years. Um, I'm glad I had that experience.
Charles? Oh,
Go ahead, Mary.
thank you so much. I echo what Julie said. It was so intimately spoken. The ice cream story is the second time I've heard that from you, and I was really brought into that, especially when you talked about holding hands. Man, it's I'm wondering, you know, a phrase I've been really working with the last few weeks since we've all started this together. When I think about the experiences we have when we're so little around race, is as children in those moments, we're fresh from God. That's the phrase I've been looking at. We're fresh from God. And we're being just smacked in the face with the cold reality of like you at the ice cream store. And I'm wondering, do you, when you say that's with you all the time, just like my stories are with me all the time, what feeling do you bring into the room with that? I know that's a real intimate question, but if you wouldn't mind.
That's a great question. Yeah, and spot on actually. I also often remember a book I read recently by Verna Dozier, who was a lay theologian in the Episcopal faith, a Black woman who was an educator. And she says, she had this simple point she makes, we know it, but she makes it so vividly and clearly. We are a faith in community. And because of, I think, really that particular experience, my having been, to a great extent, raised by a Black woman, she's my community.
Thank you, Charles, for that.
Charles, being in a small town in Arkansas, how did Osceola react when integration was finally initiated? And did your parents have feelings about that?
Yeah, of course, like much of the South, there were a lot of people who were very vocal, and you knew exactly how they felt about it, and it was not good. But my parents were, I think, respectful of certainly Dr. King, of the nonviolent movement, of the Southern Christian Coalition that was so much a part of the movement. And yet, when the schools integrated, and they fully integrated my ninth grade year, my parents were deeply concerned that the quality of the education in the school system would be destroyed. So much so that they, you don't have school options when you're in a little rural town like that. If I weren't to attend the local school, I'd have to be sent away to a boarding school. And in fact, one of my friends from down the street, who's 2 years older, his parents, his family went through the same thing, and he did go to Columbia Military Academy, which is in Columbia, Tennessee. That was one of the options available. There weren't a lot of options. Even there were none closer. I mean, that was where you would go, one or another boarding school. And Phil Langston is who I'm talking about. Some of you may know Phil. He's now a facial plastic surgeon in Germantown. Phil got a much better education in mathematics than I did. Ringing true. It wasn't totally the integration. It's just my school system stunk on mathematics, and we had no physicians in my class. A couple of engineers. They happened to transfer into our school district fairly late, and somehow still got the math. Lots of lawyers and educators, but no math training. So that was a factor in our school system. And Phil went away and got a better education. So that was the biggest thing that I can recall, Mary Lou. That's a good question. My parents were concerned about that, but not so much about other things. And then the experience of integration, and of course, many of you will share the same thing. Everything was better. And I hope was better, certainly for the students coming in from Rosenwald. We had better athletics. We were undefeated my ninth grade year. We really gained a lot, I think, and I think that's been true in integration in the workplace. And personally, I hope that our faith, our church experience will at some point be embrace the rest of our community, and that we'll see the same gains from that. I meant to mention earlier too, Mary had great pictures from her childhood, and I have none that would be relevant. It'd be really neat if anybody else has pictures they can bring to it. We can put those on the share screen.
Are there any other questions for Charles?
Hey, Charles, it's Betsy Hood.
Hey,
I have
Betsy.
a question. What exactly was your parents' concern about why the education would decline? Do you know what their specifics were? I'm just curious.
Yeah, the other kids simply had not been prepared very well. Now, again, I had Black children in my classes. Well, I had Black teachers, yeah, from sometime in junior high school, but it wasn't complete. So it was an elective. It was something some kids could do. But then ninth grade, everybody came together. And their concern was that those children hadn't been as well prepared, were not disciplined, and would disrupt. I think those two things more than anything else. It wasn't so much the sociological aspect of it, although there may have been some concern like that. I don't recall that resonating at the time. It was really just purely the effect on the educational system, because they knew very well, I knew very well, that the so-called separate but equal school system was no kind of equal. It was a travesty.
Charles, Julie, I have another question. Was I talking over someone? I apologize if so.
We'll come back to Mark.
So is Viola still in your life? And if not, at what point did you lose contact with
Mm.
her? I mean, you describe her as a second mother, as raising you, but did that relationship, you know, kind of peter out? You lost touch when you left for school, or it was a clean when you didn't need a nanny anymore? You know, and I guess would you talk about your feelings around that? That's so personal, but that's my question.
Yeah, I'll confess it's kind of hard to talk about. She passed away. Uh, I guess I was sixth grade. So, I mean, right after I started school. But I hadn't thought about what if she'd, yeah, I definitely would have stayed in touch with her. Yeah, but didn't have the opportunity.
I've got a question, Charles, and this is more about the after you left, I guess. Is Osceola still, is the high school still integrated, or did there's stories like Leland, Mississippi is a famous town where the farmers said, we're going to integrate in 1970, and the farmers' kids and they all were integrated, but then the next generation decided to start an academy for the white kids. And so has Osceola in the future, did an all-white academy or private school occur?
It did, but it took a long time. And it's in Wilson, Arkansas. It's called the Delta Academy. I think it's fairly recent that's developed. So there was no private education there, and there wasn't enough critical mass, I suppose, to crack. I know it was discussed. I remember that being something that was possible, but it just didn't happen there. It did happen, though, as you point out, Mark, in a lot of places, and caused segregation to recur in a different way.
Well, in that school you mentioned, isn't that more of an art school?
I don't really know. It's in the next town,
Right.
Wilson, Arkansas, which is 14 miles south of Osceola on US 61. Interesting town, by the way. Has a lot of interesting history itself. But that's the only private school there I know of, and you know, I've been away from there happily for a long time. So I don't know.
Thank you, Charles, for taking questions, and thank you all for your thoughtful questions for Charles. At this point, we're going to take about 5 minutes for you to journal individually, reflecting on Charles's story. And I'm going to put some questions for y'all to think about in the chat. Is there part of Charles's story that reflects your own? Where were you challenged by Charles's story? Where were you moved with compassion for Charles and for yourselves? What feelings arose during the session, and how do you plan to use them? So I'm just going to allow 5 minutes for y'all to journal. You can feel free to turn your screen off if you don't, that helps you. And I'll play some music while we do this as well. All right, everyone. I hope this time of journaling was helpful for you as you reflect on Charles's story and where it intersects with your own. At this point, we are going to put everyone in breakout rooms for the last portion of our class. So you can share some of what you wrote with the members of your breakout room and see where your stories intersect. I've not done breakout rooms very often, so give me just a moment to do this, and then I will bring you back. Let's see. All right, here we go. But thank you all for being here today. I hope that you all had meaningful conversations with each of your groups. And thank you, Charles, for leading us today and sharing your story.
Yes, thank you, Charles.
Can we close in a brief prayer? Thank you. Gracious and loving God, thank you for this time together, where we get to be together even though we are separate. Thank you for the vulnerability of Charles and everyone who is in this class, and the willingness to explore our own racial identities as we seek to serve you and as we seek to be your people, and recognizing all as your children. We say this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Hope you all have a great rest of your Sunday, and I will see you in worship.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Charles.
Bye.